Sarah stretched on her tiptoes, fingers barely grazing the spine of modern architectural design on the top shelf of Emory University's library. "Need some help with that?" David's voice was warm as honey as he effortlessly retrieved the book, their eyes meeting for the first time. Their fingers brushed as he handed her the book, and Sarah felt an unexpected spark that made her heart skip a beat. "Thank you," she whispered, lost in his green eyes. "Architecture and engineering," Sarah smiled. "We're basically designing the future together." David laughed, completely captivated by her passion and intelligence shining through every word. Days melted into weeks of secret stolen moments between classes, hidden coffee dates in quiet corners where no one would see them together. "I've never felt this connected to someone," David whispered, tucking a strand of Sarah's blonde hair behind her ear, their secret romance blossoming in hidden places. Sarah's laughter was music to his ears as they sat in their secret hideaway. And in that moment, David knew their souls were perfectly intertwined. Their connection transcended the physical. They could read each other's thoughts, finish each other's sentences, as if they'd been searching for each other their entire lives. "I feel like I've known you forever," Sarah whispered, her heart overflowing with emotions she'd never experienced before, their souls connecting on the deepest level. "You're my missing piece," David said softly, knowing with absolute certainty that Sarah was his soulmate, his destiny, his everything. "Tell me about your family," David asked, genuinely wanting to know everything about the woman who had captured his heart so completely. "My dad, Robert, built half of Atlanta's skyline." Sarah beamed with unmistakable pride. "And my mom, Margaret, is the strongest, most loving woman I know. The construction business runs in our blood. Dad always says we build more than buildings. We build dreams and futures for families. We've been in Atlanta for generations. The Mitchell family has deep roots here, through every season of life, good times and challenging ones." "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said with her radiant smile, completely unaware that she had just detonated a bomb in David's world. The name Mitchell hit David like lightning, every muscle in his body tensing as his coffee cup trembled in his suddenly unsteady hands. David's face drained of all color as the surname echoed in his mind, but he couldn't understand why this name felt like a curse, like poison in his ears. "David, what's wrong? You look terrified," Sarah whispered, her heart beginning to race as she watched the man she loved transform before her eyes. But David couldn't explain the storm raging inside him, couldn't understand why her beautiful name felt like a dagger to his heart, couldn't make sense of his family's mysterious pain. I have to go," David stammered, standing abruptly and leaving Sarah sitting there, completely bewildered, wondering what terrible secret her name had just unleashed. Before we continue this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you're already hooked, and subscribe for more tales of love that conquers all. David trudged through his family's front door, the weight of Sarah's surname crushing his chest like a physical burden. The name Mitchell had haunted this household for 25 years, spoken only in whispers of pain and betrayal that had torn their world apart. Every step felt heavy as lead, his mind racing with the impossible reality. The woman who completed his soul bore the name of his family's greatest enemy. How could he face his parents knowing he had fallen in love with a Mitchell? The very thought made his stomach churn with dread, knowing that this secret could destroy what remained of his family's fragile peace after decades of carefully rebuilt lives. "You're home late again, son," James Thompson said, folding his newspaper with the deliberate care of a man who had learned to treasure quiet family moments. His weathered face, etched with lines from years of struggle, studied David's troubled expression with paternal concern. The green eyes that David had inherited now carried the weight of a man who had been betrayed by those he trusted most, yet still held deep love for his family. "Your mother's been worried sick. You've been different lately, distant, distracted. What's troubling you?" James set the paper aside completely, giving his son his full attention with the intensity of a father who sensed something was seriously wrong with his boy. David's heart hammered against his ribs as he struggled to find words. "Dad, I need to ask you something about the Mitchell family." The name slipped from his lips like a forbidden curse, hanging in the air between them with the weight of 25 years of buried pain. He watched his father's face transform from concern to something much darker, much more dangerous. "Why do we never talk about them? What happened between our families that causes such pain in this house?" His voice trembled despite his efforts to remain calm, knowing he was opening wounds that had never properly healed, wounds that might now destroy his own chance at happiness. The newspaper hit the floor like a gunshot as James erupted from his chair, his face contorting with 25 years of suppressed fury and betrayal that came roaring to the surface like lava from a volcano. "Don't you ever mention that cursed name in this house." His voice thundered through their small home, rattling windows and shaking the very foundations with the force of his anguish. "Robert Mitchell," he spat the name like it was poison on his tongue. "That snake, that traitor who destroyed everything we built together." His hands clenched into fists as decades of buried pain exploded into the room. "We were brothers, David. Brothers. And when I needed him most, when our lives hung in the balance, he turned his back on me and saved himself." Helen Thompson burst from the kitchen, her auburn hair catching the light as she moved with the swift grace of a woman accustomed to crisis management. "James, what's happening?" I heard shouting, her gentle brown eyes filled with the wisdom of a woman who had held this family together through their darkest hours, darted between her husband and son with growing alarm. The dish towel in her hands trembled as she recognized the familiar signs of her husband's deepest trauma surfacing again. She had been their anchor through bankruptcy, shame, and reconstruction, the quiet strength that kept them afloat when the world seemed determined to drown them. "David's sweetheart, what did you ask him? Why are you bringing up the past?" Her voice carried both maternal concern and protective fear for her husband's fragile emotional state. The flashback transported them to a golden time that felt like another lifetime entirely. In 1999, James Thompson and Robert Mitchell stood in the luxurious offices of Thompson Mitchell Construction, surrounded by awards, commendations, and the tangible proof of their incredible success together. They were shaking hands over their latest multi-million-dollar contract, two best friends who had built an empire from nothing but determination, integrity, and an unshakable bond of brotherhood. Their company was legendary in Atlanta's construction industry, known for never cutting corners, never compromising on quality, and always treating their workers and clients like family. They were more than business partners. They were brothers in every way that mattered, men who trusted each other completely and implicitly. The flashback deepened, showing Sunday barbecues where the Thompson and Mitchell families gathered like one extended, loving clan. James and Robert would stand side by side at the grill, planning their next project while their wives Margaret and Helen shared recipes and dreams, their children playing together in the yard with the innocent joy of kids who had no idea that their perfect world could ever end. Those were the days of prosperity and unshakable friendship, when Thompson Mitchell Construction was building half of Atlanta's skyline, and both families lived in beautiful homes in the best neighborhoods. Their success was built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared Christian values, and a friendship that seemed blessed by God Himself. They were prosperous, respected, and utterly convinced that their brotherhood would last forever. Helen's maternal instincts were screaming that something was catastrophically wrong with her son. She studied David's face with the penetrating gaze of a mother who had raised this boy from birth, reading the love and anguish written in his green eyes like an open book. "David, honey, you're not just curious about ancient history. Something's happening right now that's tearing you apart from the inside." Her voice was gentle but insistent, carrying the authority of a woman who had shepherded this family through impossible circumstances. "I can see it in your eyes, the way you've been acting lately, coming home late, distracted, checking your phone constantly, carrying some secret that's breaking your heart. What aren't you telling us, sweetheart?" Behind her, James continued to pace like a wounded animal, his rage still simmering dangerously close to the surface. Meanwhile, across town at Emory University, Sarah Mitchell sat alone on the bench where she and David used to meet every day, her blue eyes clouded with confusion and devastating hurt. For 3 days now, the man who had whispered that she was his soulmate had been avoiding her completely, canceling their coffee dates, skipping their study sessions, responding to her desperate texts with cold, distant messages that felt like daggers to her heart. She replayed their last conversation over and over in her mind, searching for clues, trying to understand what she had said or done that had transformed her loving, gentle David into a complete stranger. The autumn leaves drifted around her as she waited, hoping against hope that he would appear and explain why her perfect world had suddenly crumbled into ashes. She couldn't comprehend how someone could say they loved you one day and then act like you didn't exist the next. David sat alone in their favorite corner of the university library, staring at the same page of his engineering textbook for what felt like hours, his mind completely unable to focus on anything except Sarah's beautiful face and the impossible situation that was tearing his heart in two. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run to her, to take her in his arms and never let go, to tell her that he loved her more than his own life and that nothing else mattered. But he couldn't escape the terrible reality. She was a Mitchell, the daughter of the man who had destroyed his family, and bringing her into his world would reopen wounds that had taken decades to heal. He was caught between his desperate, all-consuming love for Sarah and his loyalty to the parents who had sacrificed everything to rebuild their lives from the ashes of betrayal. How could he choose between the woman who completed his soul and the family who had given him everything? The year was 1999, and James Thompson stood on the construction site of Golden Heights, Atlanta's most ambitious residential complex that would house over 500 families in luxury apartments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling work site as his expert eye ran along the steel beams and concrete foundations, his heart sinking with a terrible realization. These weren't the premium materials they had ordered and paid top dollar for. Someone had switched the high-grade steel and reinforced concrete with inferior, substandard products that would never meet the safety requirements for a building this size. His hands trembled as he examined the structural components, knowing that proceeding with these materials would be not just unethical, but potentially catastrophic for every family who would call Golden Heights home. 25 years of impeccable reputation and integrity hung in the balance as he realized they were caught in something much bigger than a simple supply error. Robert Mitchell hurried across the construction site, his polished shoes crunching on gravel as he approached his best friend and business partner with papers clutched in his determined fist. "James, we need to talk immediately. I just got off the phone with our suppliers and some very interesting people downtown." His blue eyes blazed with righteous anger as he thrust the shipping manifests toward his partner. These material substitutions weren't an accident. They were ordered by Harold Patterson's construction company as part of a kickback scheme with the city planning department. "We're being used, my friend, and I won't stand for it." Robert's voice carried the conviction of a man who had built his reputation on honesty and was ready to fight for what was right. "We have documentation, we have evidence, and we're going to expose this corruption before it goes any further." Inside the cramped construction trailer, Robert spread out documents and photos across the metal desk, his face flushed with determination to do the right thing. "Look at this evidence, James. Patterson's been running this scam for years, taking bribes to approve substandard materials, then blaming the contractors when things go wrong." He pointed to invoices and shipping records that clearly showed the material substitutions. "We have to go to the FBI, to the media, to anyone who will listen. We can't let them use Thompson Mitchell Construction as part of their corrupt scheme." But James stood frozen by the window, his face pale with terror as he contemplated the consequences of crossing powerful political forces. "Robert, you don't understand what we're dealing with here," he whispered, his voice shaking with fear. "Patterson doesn't just have political connections. He has the power to destroy us completely if we don't play along." The argument moved outside as Robert's voice rose with passionate conviction, while James retreated into fearful hesitation. "We built this company on integrity, James. We've never cut corners, never compromised our values. Never put profit over people's safety. Robert's face was red with righteous anger as he gestured toward the construction site. How can you even consider using these defective materials? How can you think about letting families move into apartments that could collapse? But James was paralyzed by visions of what Patterson could do to their families, their futures, their very lives. "You don't understand the threats I've been receiving, Robert," he said, his voice barely audible. "Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, warnings about what happens to contractors who don't cooperate. I have Helen and little David to protect. I can't risk their safety by playing hero against forces we can't defeat." As storm clouds gathered overhead, mirroring the crisis brewing between the two friends, Robert made one final desperate plea for his partner's conscience. "James, listen to me. If we use these materials, people could die. Families could be hurt. Children could be injured. And we'll have their blood on our hands forever." His voice cracked with emotion as he realized his best friend was choosing fear over principle. "I'm going to the authorities with or without you, because I can't live with myself if we proceed with this corruption." But James had already made his choice, his fear overwhelming his moral compass. "If you do that, Robert, you'll destroy us both. Patterson will make sure we're blamed for everything, and our families will pay the price for your idealism." The distance between them grew both physically and morally as they stood on opposite sides of an impossible decision. The following week, construction continued with the substandard materials as Robert watched in growing horror, and James supervised with the reluctant compliance of a man who had sold his soul to protect his family. The inferior steel beams were being installed in the main support structure, and the weak concrete was being poured for the foundation, each day bringing them closer to a disaster that Robert knew was inevitable. "This is madness, James," he whispered as they stood, watching the work progress. "Every day we delay reporting this makes us more complicit in whatever happens." But James had retreated into a shell of terrified compliance, his eyes hollow with the knowledge that he was betraying everything he had once stood for. "It's too late now, Robert. We're in too deep. All we can do is hope nothing goes wrong and pray that the building inspectors don't look too closely at the materials." The disaster struck on a rainy Tuesday morning in October when the partially completed Golden Heights complex suffered a catastrophic partial collapse during construction. The defective steel beams couldn't support the weight of the upper floors, and an entire section of the building came crashing down with a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles. 8 construction workers were trapped in the rubble, suffering grave injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives, while the collapse destroyed the foundation apartments that 50 families had already purchased and were preparing to move into. Emergency vehicles screamed onto the scene as rescue workers frantically dug through concrete and twisted steel, searching for survivors in what should have been Atlanta's most prestigious residential development. The news crews arrived within hours, broadcasting images of destruction that would haunt the city and destroy 2 lifelong friends forever. Within 24 hours, James Thompson found himself in handcuffs at the Atlanta Police Department, facing charges of criminal negligence, conspiracy to defraud, and endangering public safety. The charges were devastating and clearly designed to make him the sole scapegoat for the corruption scheme that had caused the disaster. News crews waited outside like vultures as James was processed and booked, his mugshot becoming the face of the Golden Heights tragedy in newspapers across Georgia. Harold Patterson's political machine had moved swiftly to distance themselves from the collapse, and James Thompson, the man who had hesitated to expose the corruption out of fear, became their perfect patsy. His 25 years of impeccable reputation and integrity meant nothing as he was painted as the greedy contractor who had cut corners to increase profits, willing to sacrifice safety for money. The ultimate betrayal came during the trial when Robert Mitchell was called to testify, his face pale but determined as he was sworn in as a witness for the prosecution. James sat at the defendant's table, still believing that his best friend and partner would tell the truth about Patterson's corruption and the material substitutions. But as Robert began to speak, James felt his world collapse more completely than the building ever had. James Thompson was the project supervisor who made the final decisions about materials and construction methods. Robert testified, his voice steady despite the lie that was destroying his soul. I voiced concerns about some of his choices, but he assured me that everything met safety standards. The courtroom gasped as Robert Mitchell, terrified for his own family's safety and future, threw his best friend under the bus to save himself from Patterson's wrath. Back in the present, James Thompson's voice was hoarse with emotion as he finished recounting the nightmare that had destroyed his life and his faith in friendship forever. Robert saved himself by sacrificing me to Patterson's political machine. I spent 3 years in federal prison for crimes I didn't commit, while he kept the business, kept his reputation, and built his empire on the lie that I was the corrupt one who had caused the Golden Heights disaster. Helen's tears flowed freely as she remembered those dark years of visiting her husband in prison, raising David alone, and rebuilding their lives from absolute nothing. We lost everything, David, our business, our home, our savings, our good name. When your father was finally released, we had to start over with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the knowledge that Robert Mitchell had betrayed the most sacred trust between friends. David sat in stunned silence, finally understanding why his family's pain ran so deep and why his love for Sarah Mitchell represented the ultimate cruel irony of fate. Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her Sunday dress for the 3rd time as butterflies danced in her stomach like never before. Today was the day she would introduce David to her parents, the moment she had been dreaming about since they fell in love. She had spent hours preparing the perfect family dinner, choosing her father's favorite roast beef recipe and her mother's famous apple pie, wanting everything to be absolutely perfect for the man who had captured her heart completely. He's going to love them, and they're going to love him, she whispered to her reflection, smoothing down her blonde hair one final time. She could hardly contain her excitement about finally bringing together the 2 most important parts of her life, her beloved family and her soulmate David. This Sunday dinner would mark the beginning of their future together, the first step toward the wedding she had already begun planning in her dreams. Robert Mitchell sat in his leather armchair reading the Atlanta Journal-Constitution while Margaret fussed with a fresh arrangement of roses from their garden, both parents eager to meet the young man who had brought such joy to their daughter's life. "She's been absolutely glowing these past few weeks," Margaret said, stepping back to admire her floral masterpiece. "I haven't seen Sarah this happy since she was accepted to Emory's architecture program. This, David, must be something very special to capture our girl's heart so completely." Robert looked up from his newspaper with a warm smile, his blue eyes twinkling with paternal pride. "Any young man who makes our Sarah smile like that is welcome at our table. I'm looking forward to hearing about his plans for the future, his family background, what kind of man he's becoming. Sarah's always been an excellent judge of character, so I'm sure we'll approve of her choice." Sarah practically bounced on her toes as she waited on the front porch of her family's beautiful colonial home, her heart racing with anticipation as she spotted David walking up the tree-lined street. But something was wrong. Instead of the confident, loving man she knew, David approached with obvious reluctance, his green eyes filled with an anxiety that made her stomach clench with worry. "David, you made it," she called out, running to meet him halfway up the walkway, but when she tried to take his hand, she noticed it was trembling slightly. "Are you okay? You look like you're about to face a firing squad instead of a family dinner." She searched his face with growing concern, unable to understand why the man who had whispered about their future together now seemed terrified to meet the people who had raised her. "Hey, it's just my parents. They're going to love you as much as I do. I promise." Sarah led David into the dining room, where her parents stood waiting with warm, welcoming smiles, completely unaware that they were about to come face to face with the son of the man they considered their greatest enemy. "Mom, Dad, I'd like you to meet David," Sarah announced with pride radiating from every word, her blue eyes sparkling with happiness as she prepared to unite the 2 halves of her heart. "David, these are my parents, Robert and Margaret Mitchell. I've told them so much about you, about how wonderful and kind and brilliant you are. Margaret stepped forward with her arms open for a welcoming embrace, her maternal warmth immediately apparent. "David, sweetheart, we've heard nothing but amazing things about you. Sarah talks about you constantly. Your engineering studies, your dreams, your sweet romantic gestures. We're so thrilled to finally meet the young man who's made our daughter so incredibly happy these past few weeks." The moment Robert Mitchell looked into David's green eyes, the warm welcome died on his lips as recognition crashed over him like a tsunami of horrific memories. Those eyes, he had seen those exact same green eyes 25 years ago, filled with the same gentle intelligence, but belonging to the man who had destroyed his family's peace forever. "Thompson," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a curse as his face drained of all color. His blue eyes widened with shock and growing rage as he took in David's facial features, seeing James Thompson's face reflected in this young man who had somehow infiltrated his home and his daughter's heart. "You're James Thompson's son." It wasn't a question, but a statement of devastating realization that made the elegant dining room suddenly feel like a battlefield where old wounds were about to be torn open with fresh agony. Margaret's crystal serving dish crashed to the hardwood floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces that scattered across the room like fragments of broken dreams. "Oh my God, no," she gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth as the terrible truth sank in. "Not him, not his family, not after everything they did to us." Her voice rose to near hysteria as 25 years of carefully buried trauma came roaring back to the surface. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, her mind struggling to process what was happening as her perfect family dinner dissolved into a nightmare she couldn't comprehend. "What's going on? Who is James Thompson? Why are you acting like David is some kind of criminal?" Her voice cracked with confusion and growing panic as she watched her loving parents transform into people she didn't recognize, their faces twisted with a hatred that seemed to come from some deep, festering wound she knew nothing about. "Get out!" Robert's voice thundered through the dining room with such force that the crystal glasses on the table trembled, his finger pointing toward the door like a weapon aimed at David's heart. "Get out of my house this instant." His face had turned purple with rage as decades of suppressed fury exploded like a dam bursting. "No Thompson will ever set foot in this house again. Do you hear me, boy? Never." His blue eyes blazed with a fire that Sarah had never seen before, transforming her gentle, loving father into someone she didn't recognize. "Your father destroyed everything we had, everything we worked for, everything we believed in. He took food from our table, put us in debt for years, and nearly destroyed our family with his greed and corruption." Margaret stood behind her husband, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with the resurrected pain of their darkest years. "How dare you come into our home? How dare you court our daughter when your family name is poison to us?" David stood in the doorway like a condemned man, his heart breaking as he watched Sarah's face crumple with confusion and betrayal that mirrored his own pain perfectly. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of Margaret's sobbing and Robert's continued shouting. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted you to be hurt." He could see the questions burning in her blue eyes, the desperate need to understand how her perfect world had just exploded into fragments around her feet. "I have to go," he said, backing toward the front door as Robert continued his tirade about the Thompson family's supposed crimes. "I'll explain everything later, I promise. But I have to leave before this gets worse." The last image he saw before fleeing the Mitchell house was Sarah standing among the broken crystal, her face pale with shock and her hands reaching out toward him with desperate confusion. "What just happened?" Sarah's voice cracked like a whip through the suddenly quiet house as she cornered her parents in the living room, her blue eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and desperate confusion. "Why did you just destroy the man I love? Why did you treat him like he was some kind of monster? Who is James Thompson, and what does he have to do with David?" Her voice rose with each question as she watched her parents exchange the kind of meaningful look that comes from shared secrets and old wounds. "I have been in love with David for weeks, planning our future together, and you just threw him out of our house like he was garbage. I deserve to know why. Margaret collapsed into her favorite armchair, her face buried in her hands as sobs racked her body. Oh, Sarah, sweetheart, you don't understand. That family, they destroyed us. They took everything we had and left us with nothing but debt and shame. Your father spent years rebuilding what James Thompson tore down with his greed and corruption. As the evening shadows lengthened across their elegant living room, Robert and Margaret began to tell their daughter their version of the Thompson family's betrayal, painting a picture of James Thompson as a greedy, corrupt contractor who had nearly destroyed their lives through his criminal negligence and moral bankruptcy. James Thompson was our business partner 25 years ago, before you were born, Robert said, his voice heavy with old pain and carefully constructed lies. We trusted him like a brother, and he repaid that trust by using substandard materials in a major construction project, taking bribes from corrupt suppliers. And when the building partially collapsed and people were hurt, he tried to blame everyone else for his crimes. Sarah listened with growing horror, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile this image of corruption and betrayal with the gentle, loving man she had seen in David's eyes whenever he spoke about his father. The Thompson family cost us everything, Sarah. Our business, our reputation, nearly our home. We spent years paying for James Thompson's crimes, rebuilding our lives from the ashes of his corruption. And now his son has wormed his way into your heart, probably knowing exactly who we were all along. Robert and Margaret sat across from their daughter in the living room that had witnessed so many happy family moments, now heavy with the weight of secrets that were finally being dragged into the light. Sarah, sweetheart, you have to understand that what we're about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about that young man and his family, Robert began, his voice carrying the gravity of a man about to reveal painful truths. James Thompson wasn't just a business partner who made mistakes. He was a criminal who destroyed innocent lives for money. Margaret reached for Sarah's hands, her eyes still red from crying. 25 years ago, before you were born, we learned the hard way that some people will smile to your face while stabbing you in the back. The Thompson family taught us that lesson in the most painful way possible, and now history is trying to repeat itself through you. James Thompson was our business partner in Thompson Mitchell Construction, Robert continued, his blue eyes hardening with remembered pain and carefully constructed narrative. We trusted him completely, treated him like a brother, shared our dreams and our profits equally. But greed consumed him, Sarah. While we were focused on building quality homes for families, he was cutting secret deals with corrupt suppliers, using substandard materials to increase his profit margins. Robert's voice grew more intense as he painted his version of history. He convinced me to look the other way when materials didn't meet specifications, told me we could make more money if we weren't so rigid about safety standards. When I started asking questions, he became hostile, secretive, paranoid that someone would discover his corruption schemes. Margaret nodded in agreement, her face a mask of pain and righteous indignation. We started noticing discrepancies in the books, materials that were ordered but never delivered, payments to suppliers we'd never heard of. The Golden Heights project was supposed to be our masterpiece, Margaret said, her voice trembling with emotion as she recounted their version of events. 500 luxury apartments for young families starting their lives together, just like you and, well, just like we thought you and David might be. Her voice broke slightly before she continued. But James saw it as an opportunity to make a fortune through corruption. He used inferior steel, watered-down concrete, electrical systems that barely met minimal codes. When I confronted him about the safety reports, he laughed and said I was being overly dramatic about building standards. Sarah's face grew pale as she listened to her parents paint David's father as a monster of greed and negligence. He said that families living in those apartments would never know the difference, that we were overthinking the safety requirements because no one would get hurt by cutting a few corners here and there. Robert stood and began pacing the living room, his hands clenched into fists as he relived what he claimed were James Thompson's ultimate betrayals. When the building partially collapsed during construction, 8 workers were seriously injured, Sarah. 8 men with families, children, dreams of their own, lying in hospital beds because James Thompson decided their safety was worth less than his profit margins. His voice rose with righteous anger as he continued his narrative. 50 families who had already purchased apartments lost their life savings, their dreams of homeownership destroyed by one man's greed. And when the investigators started looking into the construction methods, when the media started asking questions about substandard materials, do you know what James Thompson did? Robert's blue eyes blazed with fury as he delivered what he claimed was the final insult. He tried to blame me, his own partner, his supposed best friend, the man who had trusted him with everything. Meanwhile, across town in the Thompson family's modest living room, David sat facing his father with his own demand for truth, his heart heavy with the pain of seeing Sarah's world shatter before his eyes. "Dad, I need to know everything about what really happened with Robert Mitchell 25 years ago," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "I can't go on living with half-truths and whispered fragments. Sarah deserves to know who I really am, where I come from, what my family's history means for our future together." James looked up from his worn armchair, his green eyes reflecting decades of pain and injustice that had never been properly addressed. "Son, that's a story that's going to break your heart and probably destroy any chance you have with that girl. Are you sure you want to hear the whole truth about how Robert Mitchell destroyed our family and then built his empire on the lie that I was the corrupt one? Robert Mitchell was my best friend, closer than a brother, a man I would have died for without hesitation." James began, his voice heavy with the weight of betrayal that had defined the last quarter-century of his life. "We built Thompson Mitchell Construction from nothing, with handshake deals and a commitment to integrity that was more sacred to us than any written contract. When Robert discovered that Harold Patterson's political machine was forcing us to use substandard materials in the Golden Heights project, he wanted to go to the authorities immediately. Helen joined them, sitting beside her husband as she had through countless retellings of their family's greatest tragedy. "Your father was the one who hesitated, David, not because he was corrupt, but because he was terrified of what Patterson's people might do to our families if we crossed them. But Robert was determined to do the right thing, to expose the corruption even if it cost us everything. When the building collapsed and people were hurt, Patterson's political machine needed a scapegoat, someone to take the blame for their corruption scheme." James continued, his voice breaking with emotion that was still raw after all these years. "They chose me because I was the project's supervisor, the one whose name was on all the official documents. But the real betrayal came when Robert was called to testify at my trial." James's hands trembled as he relived the moment that had destroyed his faith in human nature forever. "I sat in that courtroom, looking at my best friend in the witness box, expecting him to tell the truth about Patterson's corruption, about the material substitutions, about how we had both been victims of a political conspiracy. Instead, he looked me in the eye and lied under oath, painting me as the greedy contractor who had caused a disaster through my own negligence and corruption." Helen reached for her husband's hand, her own eyes filling with tears as she remembered the day their world ended completely. David sat in stunned silence as his father's version of events painted a completely different picture from what he imagined Sarah was hearing across town. Robert testified that I had insisted on using the substandard materials against his objections, that I had taken bribes from corrupt suppliers, that I had threatened him when he tried to report my illegal activities to the authorities, James said, his voice filled with the anguish of a man who had been abandoned by his closest friend in his darkest hour. "He saved himself by destroying me, son. While I went to prison for crimes I didn't commit, he kept the business, kept his reputation, and built his fortune on the foundation of my destroyed life." David's mind reeled as he tried to reconcile his father's story with his knowledge of the gentle, loving man who had raised him with such strong moral principles. "But Dad, if you were innocent, if Robert was lying, why didn't anyone believe you? Why didn't the truth come out during the trial?" Despite the disaster at the family dinner and their parents' fury, Sarah and David found themselves drawn together like magnets, meeting secretly on their old bench in the quiet corner of the campus where their love had first blossomed. "My parents say your father was a criminal who destroyed innocent lives for money," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper as tears streamed down her cheeks. They paint him as a monster of greed who nearly bankrupted our family through corruption and negligence. But when I look into your eyes, David, I see the same gentleness, the same integrity, the same moral strength that made me fall in love with you. How can someone raised by a criminal have such a pure heart? David took her hands in his own tears falling freely as he struggled to bridge the chasm that their family's history had created between them. And my father says Robert Mitchell was his best friend who betrayed him to save himself, who lied under oath and destroyed our family to protect his own reputation and fortune. I don't know what to believe anymore, Sarah, David confessed, his voice breaking as he held the woman he loved more than life itself. All I know is that I love you with every fiber of my being, and I can't imagine a world without you in it. But how can we build a future together when our family's past is soaked in blood and betrayal? How can we ask them to accept a love that represents everything they've spent 25 years trying to forget? Sarah looked into his green eyes, seeing her own anguish reflected there perfectly. I'm torn between my love for you and my loyalty to my parents, between my heart that tells me you're the most honorable man I've ever known and my family's insistence that your father's crimes make you unfit for their daughter. I don't know how to choose between the man I want to spend forever with and the parents who gave me everything, who sacrificed so much to provide for me, who are begging me not to repeat their mistakes by trusting another Thompson with my heart and future. Sarah and David made the decision that would change everything as they sat surrounded by stacks of old newspapers, legal documents, and microfilm readers in the research section of the Atlanta Public Library. We can't live the rest of our lives with this shadow hanging over us, Sarah said, her blue eyes determined despite the exhaustion that showed on her face from sleepless nights of anguish. We need to know the truth, David. Not your father's version, not my parents' version, but the actual truth about what happened 25 years ago. David nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of their impossible situation. My family has carried this burden of injustice for my entire life, and your family has carried the pain of betrayal for just as long. Somewhere in these records, in these newspaper archives, in these court documents, lies the real story that will either prove our love is built on a foundation of truth or show us that we're fighting a battle we can never win. The newspaper headlines from October 1999 told a story of tragedy and corruption that made both young people's hearts race with recognition and dread. Golden Heights collapse injures 8 workers, displaces 50 families, Sarah read aloud, her voice trembling as she saw her father's construction company mentioned prominently in every article. Thompson Mitchell Construction under investigation for safety violations, David read from another headline, his green eyes scanning the text for any clues about the real truth behind his family's downfall. The articles painted a picture of a construction project gone horribly wrong, but the details were frustratingly vague about who is actually responsible for the material substitutions and safety violations. Look at this, Sarah, David said, pointing to a small paragraph buried on page 3 of the Atlanta Constitution. It mentions that the investigation was being led by a special prosecutor with ties to Harold Patterson's political organization. Why would Patterson be involved in investigating a construction accident unless he had something to hide? As they dug deeper into the archived records, inconsistencies in the official investigation began to emerge like cracks in a carefully constructed facade. David, look at this shipping manifest from the steel supplier, Sarah said, her architecture training helping her understand the technical specifications that most people would overlook. The original order was for high-grade structural steel rated for a 20-story building, but this delivery receipt shows they received steel that was barely adequate for a 3-story structure. David examined the documents with his engineering background, his eyes widening as he recognized the significance of what they were discovering. And here's the concrete analysis report from the independent lab. It shows the concrete delivered to the Golden Heights site had been watered down to less than half the required strength. But look at the signature on the approval form authorizing the material substitution. Sarah gasped as she saw the signature clearly didn't match her father's handwriting, despite the typed name beneath it claiming to be Robert Mitchell's authorization. Their investigation led them to a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta, where they hoped to find Miguel Rodriguez, one of the few surviving construction workers from the Golden Heights project who hadn't been involved in the official investigation. Mr. Rodriguez worked on the site for 6 months before the collapse, David said, checking the address they had found in the old employment records. If anyone knows what really happened with those materials, it would be someone who was there every day watching the construction process. Sarah's heart pounded as they approached the small house, knowing that whatever they learned here could either vindicate one of their fathers or destroy the last hope they had for understanding the truth. What if he doesn't want to talk to us? What if he's afraid of what might happen if he tells the truth after all these years? But David squeezed her hand reassuringly. Then we'll know that there's something worth being afraid of, something that powerful people have been hiding for 25 years. Miguel Rodriguez sat in his worn armchair, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he recalled memories he had tried to bury for over 2 decades. I remember that project like it was yesterday, he said in heavily accented English, his dark eyes filled with the weight of secrets he had carried alone for too long. Your fathers, they were good men, both of them. Never asked us to cut corners, never pushed us to work unsafe, always made sure we had proper equipment and safety gear. His voice grew quieter as he continued. But then about 2 months before the collapse, things started changing. Materials would arrive during the day, then different materials would be there in the morning. High-grade steel would disappear overnight, replaced with cheaper stuff that looked similar but felt different when you worked with it. Sarah and David exchanged meaningful glances as Miguel's story began to fill in the gaps that the official investigation had left deliberately empty. One night, I stayed late to finish some electrical work. Miguel continued, his voice growing stronger as he decided to finally tell the truth that had haunted him for years. Around midnight, I saw trucks pulling up to the construction site. Not our usual suppliers, but different trucks with no company markings. Men in expensive suits were directing workers to swap out the steel beams and concrete forms we had installed with different materials. His eyes met David's directly as he delivered the most important revelation. I hid behind some equipment and watched them work. The man giving orders wasn't your father, son, and it wasn't Mr. Robert either. It was Harold Patterson himself, the politician who owned the construction company that supplied our materials. I heard him telling his workers to make sure the substitution was complete before morning, and that no one could trace the inferior materials back to his company. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the implications of what Miguel was revealing. This was evidence that both of their fathers had been victims of a corruption scheme that went far higher than anyone had realized. Why didn't you tell the investigators about this when they questioned you after the collapse? David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Miguel's face darkened with a mixture of shame and fear that was still palpable after all these years. Because 3 days after the collapse, 2 men in dark suits came to my house, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They told me that if I mentioned seeing anything unusual at the construction site, if I talked about material substitutions or midnight deliveries, my family would disappear. They showed me pictures of my wife, my children, my grandchildren. They knew where my kids went to school, where my wife worked, what time I left for work every morning. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she understood the terror this man had lived with for decades, and how the real perpetrators of the Golden Heights tragedy had intimidated witnesses into silence. They said the investigation would focus on Thompson Mitchell Construction, and that as long as I kept my mouth shut about what I really saw, my family would be safe. But if I tried to help either of your fathers by telling the truth, we would all pay the price. That evening, Sarah climbed into the dusty attic of her family home, her heart racing as she searched through boxes of old documents that her parents had stored away from their construction business days. There has to be something here, she whispered to herself, pulling out file folders filled with contracts, invoices, and correspondence from Thompson Mitchell Construction. Some piece of evidence that proves Miguel's story, that shows my father knew the materials were being switched. Her hands trembled as she found a box labeled Golden Heights, 1999, tucked away in the far corner of the attic, covered with dust and obviously untouched for years. Inside, she discovered a treasure trove of documents that her parents had apparently saved but never mentioned. Original contracts specifying high-grade materials, shipping manifests that didn't match the materials actually delivered, and most importantly, a series of letters that would change everything she thought she knew about her family's history. The letters were in her father's handwriting, dated just weeks before the Golden Heights collapse, and they revealed a truth that shattered everything Robert and Margaret Mitchell had told their daughter about James Thompson's supposed corruption. "Dear James," Sarah read aloud in the empty attic, her voice echoing off the wooden rafters, "I've discovered that Harold Patterson's people have been systematically replacing our materials with substandard alternatives. The steel analysis I commissioned privately shows tensile strength far below specifications, and the concrete samples are dangerously watered down." Her hand shook as she continued reading her father's own words from 25 years ago. "We have enough evidence to bring down Patterson's entire corruption network, but I'm terrified of what might happen to our families if we proceed. Margaret is pregnant with Sarah, and Helen just told us about little David. Can we risk their safety to expose this conspiracy, even if it's the right thing to do?" The final letter, dated just 3 days before the collapse, contained the most devastating revelation of all. "James, I can't do it. I can't risk my family's safety for the greater good. I'm going to destroy this evidence and hope no one ever discovers what we know. Forgive me, my friend, but I choose cowardice over courage." Sarah burst into the living room where her parents were watching television, the incriminating letters clutched in her trembling hands like weapons of truth that would destroy 25 years of carefully constructed lies. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice breaking with the pain of betrayal that cut deeper than any family argument they had ever had. "How could you let an innocent man go to prison for crimes you knew he didn't commit? How could you build your fortune on a lie that James Thompson was corrupt when you knew that Harold Patterson was the one switching the materials?" Robert and Margaret stared at their daughter in shock, recognizing the letters that Robert had written in his own hand decades ago, the evidence they thought had been destroyed forever. "Sarah, you don't understand," Robert began, but his daughter cut him off with a fury that shook the very foundations of their family home. "I understand perfectly. You were a coward who saved himself by sacrificing his best friend, and then you spent 25 years lying to everyone, including your own daughter, about what really happened at Golden Heights." The living room that had been filled with so much family warmth and love now felt like a courtroom where 25 years of lies were finally being exposed under the harsh light of truth. Sarah stood before her parents like an avenging angel, the letters trembling in her hands as evidence of their betrayal burned through the very foundation of everything she had believed about her family. "These are your words, Dad," she said, her voice breaking with the pain of disillusionment that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Written in your own handwriting, dated 3 days before James Thompson's life was destroyed forever. You knew he was innocent. You knew Harold Patterson was switching the materials. You knew your best friend was about to be framed for crimes he didn't commit, and you chose to save yourself instead of saving him." Robert's face had turned ashen gray as he stared at the letters he thought had been destroyed decades ago, the evidence of his cowardice and moral failure now held in his daughter's shaking hands. "Sarah, you have to understand," Robert began desperately, his voice cracking under the weight of 25 years of suppressed guilt and shame. "I was terrified for our family, for your mother who was pregnant with you, for our future. Patterson's people had made it clear what would happen to anyone who crossed them. We would have lost everything, maybe even our lives." But Sarah's blue eyes blazed with a righteous fury that reminded Robert painfully of his younger self, back when he still believed in doing the right thing regardless of the cost. "So instead, you let James Thompson lose everything. You let him go to prison for 3 years while his wife struggled to raise their son alone, while their reputation was destroyed, while they had to rebuild their entire lives from nothing." Her voice rose with each accusation, echoing through the house like the voice of justice finally demanding payment for decades of unpaid moral debts. "You save yourself by sacrificing an innocent man, And then you had the audacity to teach me about integrity and honesty while living this massive lie." Margaret collapsed in her chair, her face buried in her hands as sobs racked her body with the force of 25 years of suppressed guilt finally breaking free. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" she repeated through her tears, her voice muffled by her hands, but still audible in the suddenly quiet room. "I've spent 25 years hating an innocent man. I've taught my daughter to despise a family that we destroyed through our cowardice." Sarah turned on her mother with the same fierce intensity, her heart breaking as she watched the woman who had raised her crumble under the weight of their shared lie. "How could you live with yourself, Mom? How could you look me in the eye every day and tell me about the importance of truth and justice while you knew that James Thompson was sitting in a prison cell for crimes he didn't commit?" Margaret looked up at her daughter through tear-swollen eyes, her face a mask of anguish and self-recrimination. "Because we convinced ourselves it was necessary, that we had no choice, that protecting our own family was more important than justice for his family." Robert's carefully constructed defenses finally crumbled completely as he faced his daughter's unwavering demand for truth and accountability. "You're right," he whispered, his voice barely audible as 25 years of lies collapsed around him like a house of cards. "Everything we told you about James Thompson was a lie. He was the most honest, most principled man I've ever known, and I destroyed him to save myself." His blue eyes filled with tears as he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done to his best friend and business partner. James wanted to expose Patterson's corruption from the beginning. When we discovered the material substitutions, he was ready to go to the FBI immediately. Consequences be damned. I was the one who convinced him to wait, to gather more evidence, to be cautious. Robert's voice broke completely as he continued his confession. "And when Patterson's people threatened our families, I was the one who panicked, who chose fear over friendship, who decided that James Thompson's life was worth less than my own family's comfort and security." Across town in the Thompson family's modest living room, David was having his own confrontation with his father, demanding answers to questions that had haunted him his entire life. "Dad, if you knew you were innocent, if you had evidence that Patterson was behind the material substitutions, why didn't you fight back harder? Why didn't you expose the truth during your trial?" His green eyes searched his father's weathered face for answers that might finally make sense of the injustice that had defined their family for decades. James looked up from his chair, his salt and pepper hair catching the lamplight as he struggled to explain decisions made in desperation and terror 25 years ago. "Son, you have to understand the position I was in. Patterson controlled the prosecutors, the judges, half the police force in Atlanta. When Robert testified against me, when my best friend looked the jury in the eye and lied about my supposed corruption, I realized I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. But the real reason I stopped fighting was because of the threats against you and your mother," James continued, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices made under impossible circumstances. 3 days into my trial, 2 men cornered Helen outside the grocery store where she worked. They showed her photographs of you playing in our backyard, David. You were just a baby, innocent and vulnerable, and they made it clear that if I continued to protest my innocence, if I kept trying to expose Patterson's corruption network, you would pay the price for my defiance. Helen joined the conversation from the kitchen doorway, her auburn hair streaked with gray from years of worry and struggle. "They described exactly how they would hurt you, sweetheart," she said to David, her voice trembling with the memory of terror that had never quite left her. "They knew your schedule, your favorite playground, the route I took when I pushed your stroller to the park. Your father made the hardest decision any parent could make. He chose to accept false imprisonment rather than risk your safety. Even in prison, I never stopped trying to prove my innocence," James said, his green eyes reflecting the determination that had sustained him through the darkest years of his life. "I wrote letters to every journalist, every civil rights organization, every government watchdog group I could find, trying to get someone to investigate Patterson's corruption network. But Patterson's influence extended far beyond Atlanta. He had connections in the state capitol, in Washington, in the media outlets that might have been able to expose the truth. David listened with growing admiration for the father who had endured so much injustice with such quiet dignity and persistent hope. I spent 3 years gathering evidence, documenting corruption patterns, building a case that would eventually bring down Patterson's entire operation. But by the time I was released from prison, Patterson had covered his tracks so thoroughly that most of the evidence had disappeared, witnesses had been intimidated into silence, and documents had been mysteriously lost or destroyed. The betrayal that hurt the most wasn't Patterson's corruption or the prosecutor's lies or even the judge's willingness to ignore evidence. James continued, his voice breaking with emotion that was still raw after all these years. It was sitting in that courtroom and watching my best friend, the man I had trusted with my life, my business, my family's future, look me in the eye and lie under oath to save himself. David saw tears streaming down his father's cheeks as James relived the moment that had shattered his faith in human nature forever. Robert knew I was innocent, son. He knew Patterson was the one behind the material substitutions. He knew I had tried to do the right thing, and he knew that his testimony would send an innocent man to prison. But he chose his own family's comfort over justice, his own reputation over our friendship, his own future over my freedom. The pain in his father's voice was so raw, so deep, that David felt his own heart breaking for the injustice his family had endured in silence for so many years. Back at the Mitchell house, Margaret stared at her husband in complete shock as she realized the full extent of his knowledge and complicity in James Thompson's destruction. You mean you knew? All these years, every time we talked about how grateful we were to escape James Thompson's corruption, every time we warned Sarah about the dangers of trusting people like that family, you knew we were lying? Her voice rose with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief that matched her daughter's earlier fury. I thought we were both victims of James's crimes, Robert. I thought we had both been deceived and betrayed by a man we trusted. But you're telling me that you knew he was innocent and you let me hate him anyway? Robert looked between his wife and daughter, seeing his family's love and respect crumbling around him like the building that had started this nightmare 25 years ago. I convinced myself that protecting our family justified anything, that keeping you safe and comfortable was worth more than James's freedom or reputation. I told myself that he was strong enough to survive prison, that he would rebuild his life eventually, that our family's happiness was more important than his family's justice. The Mitchell family living room became ground zero for the complete collapse of everything Sarah had believed about her parents and her family's moral foundation throughout her entire life. I can't believe I'm saying this, but James Thompson is a better man than you are, Dad, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. He went to prison with dignity for crimes he didn't commit, while you built your fortune on lies and cowardice. He raised a son with integrity and honor, while you raised a daughter on a foundation of deception. Margaret and Robert sat in stunned silence as their daughter continued her devastating assessment of their character. And David Thompson, the man you threw out of our house like he was garbage, is the most honest, loving, principled person I've ever known. I love him with all my heart, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life with him, regardless of what you think about his family name. Sarah's declaration hit her parents like a physical blow, the realization that their lies had not only destroyed an innocent family, but had also driven away their own daughter's love and respect. You've lost the right to have any opinion about my choices, because your judgment has been proven worthless by 25 years of lies and moral cowardice. Sarah and David sat across from Marcus Johnson, a distinguished civil rights attorney whose reputation for fighting corruption and injustice had made him their last hope for exposing the truth that had been buried for 25 years. The evidence they had gathered was spread across his mahogany desk like pieces of a puzzle that would finally reveal the complete picture of Patterson's conspiracy and Robert Mitchell's betrayal. "This is extraordinary," Marcus said, his experienced eyes scanning through the letters, witness statements, and material specifications that proved James Thompson's innocence beyond any reasonable doubt. In 30 years of practicing law, I've rarely seen a case where the evidence of wrongful conviction was this clear and this damning to the people who perpetuated the injustice. He looked up at the young couple whose love had uncovered one of Atlanta's greatest political scandals. What you've discovered here isn't just proof of your father's innocence, David. It's evidence of a conspiracy that goes to the very heart of Atlanta's political and judicial system from the 1990s. Marcus continued his analysis of the evidence with the thoroughness of a lawyer who understood the gravity of what they were attempting to accomplish. Harold Patterson's construction company had contracts worth over $50 million with the city of Atlanta during the 1990s, all of which were obtained through the same material substitution scheme you've uncovered at Golden Heights, he explained, pointing to financial records that showed a clear pattern of corruption. By using substandard materials and charging premium prices, Patterson was stealing millions of dollars from taxpayers while putting public safety at risk in dozens of construction projects across the city. Sarah leaned forward, her architecture background helping her understand the full implications of what Marcus was describing. So Golden Heights wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the one project where the scheme finally caused a disaster serious enough that someone had to take the blame, she said, her voice filled with anger at the scope of the corruption they had uncovered. Marcus's expression grew somber as he delivered news that would complicate their quest for justice significantly. Unfortunately, Harold Patterson died 10 years ago from a heart attack, taking most of his secrets to the grave with him, he said, watching as David's face fell with disappointment and frustration. His construction company was dissolved shortly after his death, and most of the city officials who were part of the original conspiracy have either died or moved away from Atlanta. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that many of the people responsible for destroying the Thompson family would never face consequences for their crimes. However, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a more hopeful tone. Patterson's son Harold Jr. still lives in Atlanta and runs a successful real estate development company. While we can't prosecute the dead, we can certainly expose the truth about what his father did and seek justice through civil courts and public accountability. Marcus reached for his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart, his voice taking on the urgency of a man who recognized the importance of moving quickly before evidence could disappear or witnesses could be intimidated into silence again. "Janet, it's Marcus Johnson. I've got a story for you that's going to blow the lid off one of the biggest corruption scandals in Atlanta's history," he said into the phone, his eyes meeting Sarah and David's as he spoke. 25-year-old conspiracy involving city contracts, material substitutions, wrongful imprisonment, and a political cover-up that reaches into some of the most powerful families in Georgia. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized they were finally taking action that could vindicate James Thompson and expose the truth that had been hidden for so long. Janet Rodriguez from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has been investigating corruption in city contracts for years. She'll want to hear this story, and she has the resources to do a thorough investigation that could finally clear your father's name. That evening, Helen Thompson sat in her modest living room, her auburn hair catching the lamplight as she made a suggestion that shocked both her husband and son with its boldness and compassion. "I think we need to reach out to the Mitchell family," she said quietly, her brown eyes filled with the wisdom of a woman who had learned that forgiveness was sometimes the only path to healing. "Margaret and I were best friends once. We raised our children together, shared our dreams and fears, supported each other through everything until this nightmare tore us apart." James stared at his wife in complete disbelief, his green eyes flashing with the anger that had sustained him through 25 years of injustice. "Helen, have you lost your mind? Robert Mitchell destroyed our lives. He sent me to prison, let our family suffer in poverty and shame, built his fortune on lies about my supposed corruption. And you want to reach out to them like nothing happened?" David nodded in agreement with his father, his own anger still fresh from the revelations of the past week. James stood up and began pacing the small living room like a caged animal, his hands clenched in a fist as he relived decades of pain and betrayal. "That man looked me in the eye in a court of law and lied under oath to save himself. He watched me get handcuffed and taken away to prison while he went home to his comfortable house and his pregnant wife." His voice rose with each word, 25 years of suppressed rage finally finding an outlet. He let his daughter grow up believing I was a criminal while my son had to defend his father's honor in schoolyards and job interviews. And now you want me to forgive him because our children fell in love. Helen remained seated, her voice calm and steady despite her husband's fury. I want you to consider that holding on to this anger is destroying you from the inside, James. I want you to think about what's best for David and Sarah, not what feels justified based on past hurts. Her words only seemed to inflame James's anger further as he continued his tirade against the Mitchell family. Across town, Margaret Mitchell was having a similar conversation with her husband, though her motivation came from guilt rather than forgiveness. "Robert, we have to do something to make this right," she said, her voice heavy with the shame that had consumed her since learning the truth about James Thompson's innocence. "We've destroyed an innocent family through our cowardice and lies. The least we can do is apologize and try to make amends." But Robert's response revealed the depth of his own fear and self-preservation instincts that had driven his original betrayal. "Margaret, if we admit publicly that I knew James was innocent, that I lied under oath at his trial, I could face criminal charges for perjury. The statute of limitations may have expired, but my career, my reputation, everything we've built could be destroyed overnight." His blue eyes were filled with the same terror that had driven his decision 25 years ago. "Sarah already hates us for what we did. Do you want to add financial ruin and public humiliation to the legacy we're leaving our daughter?" Margaret's voice grew stronger as she realized that her husband was still putting self-preservation ahead of doing the right thing, just as he had 25 years ago. "So you're going to compound 25 years of lies with more cowardice? You're going to let James Thompson die knowing that the world still thinks he's a criminal because you're afraid of the consequences of telling the truth." Her words struck Robert like physical blows, each accusation finding its mark in his guilty conscience. "Our daughter found the courage to confront us with evidence of our crimes, Robert. The least we can do is find the courage to face the man we wronged and beg for his forgiveness." But Robert shook his head stubbornly, his fear still stronger than his conscience. "I can't do it, Margaret. I can't face James Thompson knowing what I did to him. I can't look him in the eye and apologize for destroying his life to save mine. The shame would kill me." His wife stared at him with growing disappointment, realizing that the man she married was still the same coward who had sacrificed his best friend to protect himself. Despite the fierce resistance from both her husband and son, Helen Thompson picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 25 years, her hands trembling but her resolve unwavering. "I'm calling Margaret Mitchell," she announced to her shocked family, "and I'm going to suggest that we all meet together to discuss how we can help our children build a future without the burden of our past mistakes." James lunged for the phone, trying to stop her, but Helen held it out of his reach with the determination of a woman who had made up her mind completely. "Helen, don't you dare. I forbid you to contact that family. They destroyed us once, and I won't let you give them the chance to do it again." But Helen was already listening to the phone ring on the other end, her heart pounding as she prepared to bridge a chasm that had seemed unbridgeable for over 2 decades. "Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do, James. Our children's happiness is more important than our pride or our anger." When Margaret Mitchell answered the phone and heard Helen Thompson's voice for the first time in 25 years, both women felt the weight of decades of separation, pain, and lost friendship crashing over them like a tidal wave of emotion. "Margaret, it's Helen. I know this call must be a shock, but I need to talk to you about our children and about finding a way forward that honors the truth while allowing them to be happy together." Margaret's voice broke immediately as she recognized the gentle strength of the woman who had once been her dearest friend. "Helen, I'm so sorry. I just learned that Robert knew James was innocent all along. I've spent 25 years hating your family for crimes we knew you didn't commit." In both living rooms, the men of both families watched their wives with a mixture of anger, fear, and grudging admiration as the two women who had once been sisters began the delicate process of reaching across a chasm of betrayal toward the possibility of reconciliation and healing that neither family thought would ever be possible again. Pastor Williams stood alone in the sanctuary of First Baptist Church, his white hair catching the morning sunlight that filtered through the stained glass windows, depicting scenes of redemption and forgiveness. At 60 years old, he had shepherded both the Thompson and Mitchell families through their darkest hours, watching helplessly as their friendship was destroyed by fear and betrayal 25 years ago. Lord, give me the wisdom to help these families find their way back to each other, he prayed quietly, his kind brown eyes reflecting the weight of responsibility he felt for the meeting he had agreed to facilitate. He had known both James and Robert when they were young men full of dreams and integrity, and he had watched the Golden Heights tragedy tear apart not just buildings, but the very foundations of trust and friendship that had once seemed unshakable. Now, through the love of their children, God was providing an opportunity for healing that Pastor Williams knew would require nothing short of a miracle to accomplish successfully. The Thompson family entered the church sanctuary first, their footsteps echoing in the vast space as James walked with obvious reluctance, his salt and pepper hair disheveled from a sleepless night spent arguing with Helen about the wisdom of this meeting. "I still think this is a mistake," he muttered under his breath, his green eyes scanning the familiar pews where he had once worshipped alongside Robert Mitchell as brothers in faith. 25 years of pain can't be erased by one conversation in a church sanctuary. Helen walked beside her husband with quiet determination, her auburn hair streaked with gray that spoke of decades spent holding their family together through impossible circumstances. "Maybe not," she replied softly, "but 25 years of bitterness won't be healed by continuing to avoid the people who wronged us either." David followed behind his parents, his own emotions torn between loyalty to his father and love for Sarah, knowing that this meeting could either pave the way for their future together or destroy any hope of family reconciliation forever. When a Mitchell family entered the sanctuary 5 minutes later, the tension in the sacred space became almost unbearable as 25 years of separation, betrayal, and pain suddenly occupied the same room for the first time since James Thompson's trial. Robert Mitchell walked with his head down, his graying brown hair failing to hide the shame that was written across every line of his weathered face. Margaret held one of his arms while Sarah held the other, both women serving as pillars of support for a man who looked like he might collapse under the weight of his guilt and fear. "I can't do this," Robert whispered to his wife and daughter, his blue eyes filled with the same terror that had driven his original betrayal. "I can't face him after what I did. I can't look James Thompson in the eye knowing that I sent an innocent man to prison to save myself." But Sarah's grip on his arm tightened with determination, her blonde hair catching the light from the stained glass windows as she forced her father to keep walking toward the front pews where the Thompson family waited. Pastor Williams positioned himself between the two families like a referee, preparing to mediate the most important conversation of his ministry, his kind brown eyes moving between faces that carried decades of pain, guilt, anger, and desperate hope for healing. "We are gathered here today not as adversaries, but as children of God seeking truth, justice, and the possibility of reconciliation," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent 40 years helping people find forgiveness in the darkest corners of human failure. "James and Robert, you were once brothers in Christ, partners in business, friends whose bond seemed unbreakable. Helen and Margaret, you were sisters in everything but blood, raising your children together and supporting each other through every challenge life brought your way." The pastor's voice grew heavy with emotion as he continued. "The tragedy that tore you apart 25 years ago has left scars on both families that have never fully healed. But today we have the opportunity to let God's light expose the truth and begin the process of restoration." For the first time in 25 years, James Thompson and Robert Mitchell looked directly into each other's eyes, and the weight of their shared history, the brotherhood, the betrayal, the destroyed lives, crashed over both men like a tsunami of suppressed emotion. James saw in Robert's blue eyes the same fear that had driven his original cowardice, mixed now with guilt and shame that had clearly tormented him for decades. Robert saw in James's green eyes the pain of an innocent man who had suffered unspeakably for crimes he didn't commit, along with a strength and dignity that made Robert's own moral failures seem even more contemptible. "Hello, Robert," James said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "It's been a long time." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but found that no words would come, his throat constricted by 25 years of guilt and the crushing weight of finally facing the man he had betrayed so completely. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge, filled with the ghosts of their destroyed friendship and the ruins of their shattered trust. The silence was finally broken when Robert Mitchell collapsed forward in his pew, his body racked with sobs that had been building for 25 years as he faced the magnitude of what he had done to his best friend. "I'm sorry," he gasped through his tears, the words seeming inadequate even as they tore from his chest like pieces of his soul. "James, I'm so sorry for what I did to you, for what I did to your family, for the cowardice that destroyed everything we built together." Pastor Williams moved closer to Robert, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder as the broken man continued his confession. "I knew you were innocent. I knew Patterson was behind the material substitutions. I knew you were being framed, and I let it happen because I was terrified of what they would do to my family if I told the truth." Robert looked up at James through his tears, his face a mask of anguish and self-recrimination. "I chose my family's comfort over your family's justice, and I've lived with that guilt every single day for 25 years. I don't expect forgiveness, James. I don't deserve it, but I needed you to hear the truth from my own lips." James Thompson sat in stunned silence as he listened to the confession he had waited 25 years to hear, his mind and heart waging an epic battle between the anger that had sustained him through his darkest hours and the Christian forgiveness that his faith demanded of him. Every fiber of his being wanted to lash out at Robert, to make him suffer as James and his family had suffered, to demand justice for the years stolen from him and the reputation destroyed by lies. But as he looked at the broken man sobbing in the pew across from him, James also saw something he had never expected to see: genuine remorse, devastating guilt, and the kind of spiritual brokenness that could only come from a man who had finally faced the full magnitude of his sins. "Do you know what it was like, Robert?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of decades of pain. "Do you know what it was like to sit in that prison cell, knowing I was innocent, wondering how my best friend could look me in the eye and lie under oath about crimes I didn't commit?" The question hung in the air like a sword, demanding an answer that no words could possibly provide. While their husbands wrestled with 25 years of betrayal and pain, Margaret Mitchell and Helen Thompson found themselves drawn together by a force stronger than their family's conflict, the bond of sisterhood that had sustained them through childbirth, child-rearing, and the challenges of being married to ambitious men in a difficult industry. "Helen, can you ever forgive me?" Margaret whispered as she reached across the space between the pews, her brown eyes streaming with tears. "I spent 25 years hating you and James for crimes I now know you didn't commit. I taught my daughter to despise your family based on lies that I believed because I trusted my husband's version of events." Helen took Margaret's outstretched hands without hesitation, her own tears falling freely as she felt the return of a friendship she had mourned like a death for over 2 decades. "Oh, Margaret, we were both victims of our husband's choices," she said, pulling her former best friend into an embrace that bridged 25 years of separation. "You didn't know the truth any more than I knew why Robert had betrayed us. We were both just mothers trying to protect our children and support our husbands through an impossible situation." Sarah and David sat side by side in the church pew, their hands clasped tightly together as they watched their families begin the painful but necessary process of confronting 25 years of lies, betrayal, and suppressed truth. "This is really happening," Sarah whispered to David, her blue eyes filled with tears of hope and relief as she watched her mother and Helen Thompson embrace like the sisters they had once been. "Our families are actually talking to each other, facing the truth, trying to find a way forward." David squeezed her hand, his own green eyes reflecting the cautious optimism that was growing in his heart as he witnessed his father's struggle between anger and forgiveness playing out in real time. "I never thought I'd see the day when my father would be in the same room as yours without violence erupting," he murmured back to her. "But look at them, Sarah. They're not the same men they were 25 years ago. They're older, wiser, changed by suffering in ways that might finally allow them to choose healing over hatred." As they watched the scene unfold, both young people began to believe that their love might actually have the power to heal wounds that had seemed permanent and irreversible. In a moment that would define the rest of both families' lives, James Thompson stood up slowly from his pew and walked across the sanctuary to where Robert Mitchell sat broken and sobbing, his weathered hand extended in a gesture that transcended human understanding and touched the very heart of divine grace. "Robert," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his cheeks, "I forgive you." The words seemed to echo through the sanctuary like a benediction, carrying with them the power to heal wounds that had festered for a quarter of a century. Robert looked up at his former best friend with disbelief and overwhelming gratitude, hardly able to comprehend that the man he had so grievously wronged was offering him the gift of forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. Pastor Williams stood nearby with tears of joy streaming down his aged face, knowing that he was witnessing one of those rare moments when God's grace breaks through human stubbornness and transforms hearts that seemed permanently hardened by pain. "I choose to forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because holding on to this anger was destroying me and preventing our children from building the life God intended for them." James continued, his hand still extended toward the man who had once been closer to him than a brother and could be again. 6 months had passed since that miraculous day of healing, and now the same sanctuary was adorned with white roses and ribbons that spoke of new beginnings and restored hope. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the altar where Sarah and David would exchange vows representing far more than the union of two hearts. They symbolized the triumph of love over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, and faith over fear. Pastor Williams stood at the altar, his white hair combed perfectly and his kind brown eyes twinkling with joy as he prepared to officiate the most meaningful wedding ceremony of his ministry. In a scene that would have been unimaginable months earlier, James Thompson and Robert Mitchell stood side by side at the front of the church, both men wearing matching black tuxedos and serving together as fathers in a gesture that symbolized their renewed friendship and shared commitment to their children's happiness. The transformation in both men was remarkable. James carried himself with the dignity of a man whose name had been cleared, while Robert bore the peaceful countenance of someone who had received forgiveness and committed himself to making amends. "I never thought I'd see this day," James whispered. "Our children getting married in the church where we used to worship together as brothers." Robert nodded, his blue eyes reflecting the wonder and gratitude of a man given a second chance he never deserved. Helen Thompson and Margaret Mitchell sat together in the front pew, their restored friendship evident as they held hands and shared tissues as the wedding processional began. Both women wore elegant dresses, Helen in navy blue and Margaret in dusty rose, their hair styled perfectly for their children's special day. "Look how beautiful our children are," Margaret whispered through tears of joy, squeezing Helen's hand. "When I think about how close we came to losing all of this because of our family's pride and fear." Helen squeezed back, her own tears flowing freely. "But God used their love to heal our families and restore our friendship. Our children were destined to find each other and bring us all back together." The wedding processional unfolded like a fairy tale as the wedding party walked down the aisle decorated with white roses and spring greenery that spoke of new life and fresh beginnings. Sarah's college friends served as bridesmaids, their faces glowing with happiness for their friend who had fought so hard for love and won against impossible odds. David's engineering classmates stood as groomsmen, young men who had supported their friend through discovering family secrets and choosing love over bitterness. The church filled with soft sounds of joy, gentle weeping and rustling programs as guests watched each member take their place at the altar, remembering how just months ago this sanctuary had been filled with tension and 25 years of unresolved pain. David Thompson stood at the altar in his black tuxedo, his green eyes fixed on the back of the church as he waited for his bride to appear. His hands trembled with nervous excitement, but his face radiated the joy of a man about to marry not just the woman of his dreams, but the person who had helped him discover truth, seek justice, and witness the miracle of forgiveness that had restored both their families. Every moment of their courtship flashed through his mind. Their first meeting in the library, secret dates when their families were enemies, the pain of discovery, the investigation that uncovered lies, and the miraculous reconciliation that made this day possible. As the wedding march began, David's heart swelled with anticipation for Sarah to walk down the aisle into the rest of their lives together. When Sarah appeared in her wedding gown, the entire congregation rose in a gesture acknowledging not just her beauty, but the courage she had shown in pursuing truth and demanding justice for both families. Her dress was ivory silk and French lace with a cathedral train, her blonde hair styled elegantly with her grandmother's pearl combs. But it was the radiant smile and joy in her blue eyes that took everyone's breath away, especially David's as he watched his bride approach with tears of happiness. Robert Mitchell walked beside his daughter with obvious pride and gratitude, his blue eyes reflecting the wonder of a man given the privilege of escorting his daughter to marry the son of the man he had wronged, in a gesture of reconciliation that spoke of God's ability to bring beauty from ashes. Pastor Williams opened his Bible and began with words carrying extra meaning. Dearly beloved, we witness the union of Sarah and David, whose love has accomplished the impossible, healing broken relationships, restoring friendships, and triumphing truth over deception. As the couple faced each other, hands joined and eyes locked, everyone felt the power of love that had overcome decades of pain, transformed enemies into family, and proven forgiveness stronger than revenge. The ceremony proceeded with readings about love, faith, and truth's power to set people free, each word resonating with special significance for families who had experienced these biblical principles in the most dramatic way possible. When Sarah and David exchanged personally written vows, their words carried the weight of everything they had endured and hoped to build together. David, you are my answered prayer, my proof that God brings beauty from broken situations, Sarah began, her voice clear despite tears. Your love taught me that forgiveness is stronger than hatred, truth more powerful than lies, and some bonds too strong to be broken by human failure. David's vows were equally moving as he spoke of how Sarah's courage in seeking truth had cleared his father's name and shown him what real love looked like. Sarah, you didn't just capture my heart. You liberated my family from injustice and showed me love is worth fighting for. I promise to love you with the same courage you showed in demanding truth and seeking justice for both our families. As Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the sanctuary erupted in applause and tears of joy that washed away the last vestiges of 25 years of pain. You may kiss your bride, he announced with a broad smile, and when David kissed Sarah for the first time as his wife, the congregation rose in spontaneous, standing ovation, celebrating not just their marriage, but the miracle of reconciliation that made it possible. James Thompson and Robert Mitchell embraced like the brothers they once were and were becoming again, while Helen and Margaret wept together with mother's joy. The newlyweds turned to face their families, faces radiant as they walked down the aisle hand in hand toward a future built on truth, forgiveness, and love that conquers all. Christmas Eve found both families gathered in the Mitchell living room, now decorated with twinkling lights and a magnificent tree sparkling with ornaments from both family traditions. Sarah Thompson sat on the sofa, her hand resting on her pregnant belly while David knelt beside her, his green eyes filled with wonder at their new life. Next Christmas, we'll have a new little one to celebrate with, Margaret said joyfully. James and Robert sat by the fireplace, their friendship fully restored as they planned Thompson-Mitchell construction, rebuilt, dedicated to integrity and safety. As the evening progressed with shared stories and laughter, everyone understood they were witnessing the complete triumph of love over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, and God's grace over human failure. The families once torn apart by fear were now united by love, truth, and the promise of new generations who would grow up knowing some wounds can be healed when people choose forgiveness over bitterness. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this incredible story of love and forgiveness? Comment below and let me know what touched your heart most about Sarah and David's journey. If this moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing tales that prove love conquers all.